Elijah McClain's family is planning to file a civil lawsuit over the 23-year-old's death. McClain died last year after police in Aurora, Colorado, held him in a chokehold and administered ketamine. This weekend, thousands of protesters took to the streets of Aurora to demand systemic change. NBC News correspondent Blaine Alexander reports.
Well, Allison, an attorney for Elijah McClain's family tells me that they are preparing to file a civil lawsuit in this case. All eyes right now are on the state attorney general, waiting to determine whether he will find that charges should be filed in this case. He has now launched an investigation, so ordered by the state's governor, conducting an independent investigation into this. Now, remember, Elijah McClain's death happened some 10 months ago or so. At the time, there was a news conference and certainly looked into, but it was the resurgence of interest after the death of George Floyd, the intense protests around the country that drew more attention to this case. And that's why you have not only a state investigation, but the local city council and the mayor saying that they're preparing to launch an investigation of their own. So I spoke with an attorney for McClain's family, and they say that not only are they concerned about the way that he was restrained, but also the drug that was administered to him. Police say to calm him down. All of this takes place as hundreds of people came together in protests over the weekend to honor McClain's life.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.